and greetings all. Thanks so much once again for joining us tonight. My name is Jared Bluestein and I'm a member of the Arusha Staff Collective. We like to start off all events and gatherings with a land acknowledgement, as we can't know where we're going if we don't know where we are. So we would like to acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Blackfoot Nations, which include the Siksika, the Pekainai and Nakainai. We also acknowledge the Sarsi Dene of Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda of Morley, which includes Bearspaw, Chiniki, Wesley Nakota First Nations, the Métis Nation, Region 3, and all people who make their home in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. Before we begin, I just want to share a little bit about the Arusha and the Transition series. The Arusha Center Society was founded back in 1972 and was originally focused on anti-racist work and organizational change. Today, we operate three major programs, being Calgary Dollars, which is a local complementary currency system that allows us to escape the vagaries and multitude of issues with our current monetary system while creating a localized, robust, and connected economy that prioritizes alternative forms of capital. Calgary Dollars operates in three major ways: as a hyper-localized classified system, sort of like Kijiji or Craigslist, as a support and rewards program for local businesses, and as a collaboration with affordable housing agencies to activate community economic development tactics and goals. Arusha also operates Take Action grants. It's a grassroots micro granting program for various social, economic, environmental projects. Applications are due on the 15th of every month. And as we say, put our money where your mouth is. Lastly, we operate Open Streets events, which was founded in 2012 and is focused on participatory public spaces, active transportation, and the just transition to renewable energy system. As an events-based program, we were more recently motivated by the dual crisis of COVID and a hostile government to find ways to maintain momentum, action, and solidarity for progressive groups and organizations in Alberta. And we're fortunate enough to co-develop the Transition series. We are so thrilled and appreciative to be part of this collaborative series, as it honors a legacy of action series that Arusha used to operate. We've done events with Vandana Shiva, David Corton, John Rolstensall, Andrew Weaver, the Yes Men, Naomi Klein, Avi Lewis, and others. And we are so thrilled to add Kshama Sawant to that amazing roster of inspiring people. Transition series is a generative, creative, and solution-based event series. It aims to identify and address various social, political, economic, and environmental issues rooted here in our geographical context. And in the spirit of allyship, solidarity, and strength in numbers, this is indeed a collaborative series that once again seeks to maintain momentum, solidarity, and action for progressives facing challenges today. Our collaborators include the Calgary Climate Hub, Green Calgary, Fridays for Future, Fair Trade Calgary, Engineers Without Borders, TedX Calgary, the Parkland Institute, Create, Calgary Permaculture Guild, the Allium Restaurant Worker Cooperative, and of course, Public Interest Alberta. As you know, we are so fortunate and grateful to be invited to collaborate with PIA for this Transition Series event. And so please allow me now to introduce the president of PIA, Terry Price.
Thank you, Jared. We're thrilled to be here and to be part of this as well. And firstly, I would like to start by acknowledging I am a part of the settler community and a guest here on Turtle Island. I am speaking to this group today from Treaty 6 territory. I am a visitor to their land, and I am honored that they have welcomed me as a guest. So PIA, Public Interest Alberta, was established in 2004. We're now in our 16th year. And it's a nonprofit organization that is supported by the major labor unions within the province, mostly public, but some private as well, or private sector, and civil society organizations and like-minded individuals. Our mission is to protect, promote, enhance public services at the municipal, provincial, and federal level. Our primary focus, of course, being the provincial level. And needless to say, this provincial government has given us lots and lots of work to do. We have identified 7 areas at our incorporation in 2004 that are our primary focus, and they include democracy, K-12 education, post-secondary education, seniors, childcare and early learning, human services and poverty, and the environment. The first 6 of those, we have task force that operate and meet regularly, whether quarterly or monthly, depending on which group it is, and is comprised of advocates and workers, people that have a vested interest in those particular areas. Normally at this time of year, we are hosting our annual advocacy conference. And in fact, that's how we ended up in this partnership with the Arusha Center. We had initially contacted Kashama to be a guest speaker at a video conference series we were doing in lieu of our conference. And she had agreed to be part of that series. And then we entered a transition wherein our sitting executive director announced that he was moving to a very related organization in BC. He's now with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives BC office. And so we were without an executive director and therefore unable to really carry forward with the speaker series that we had envisioned. So we have collaborated with the Arusha Center before on many issues or events. So this became a natural collaboration to keep the event going with Kshama being here. And I'm pleased to announce to people that are with us tonight, if you're not already aware, that we have recently appointed Bradley LaFortune as our new executive director, commencing April 15th. So I would like to now turn it over to Brad so that he can speak with us for a bit. So Bradley.
Thank you so much, Terry, for the introduction and for all of your leadership at Public Interest Alberta. I am so excited to start my new job that I thought I'd come early and be with you all here tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brad LaFortune. I am an activist and a campaigner here on Treaty 6 territory, where I've spent most of my life working on campaigns and making some good trouble as much as I can. My pronouns are he, him. I am a father, a democratic socialist, a proud Albertan, and I'm so excited to be joining the PIA team with Laura and Terry at the helm. It's such a critical time for our province right now, as we all know. And though I haven't left my current job just yet, when I heard that you, Kshama, would be here tonight, I couldn't miss the opportunity to get an early start. Here in Alberta, Jason Kenney and the UCP, I believe, pose an existential threat to the health and prosperity of our province and to working people across our province. Not only has this government been hell-bent on cutting and privatizing, but now they also want to completely rewrite our history and with it our future. You just have to look at their draft K6 curriculum released last week, and if it had dinosaurs in it, we could call it prehistoric, but it doesn't. And we can't let any of this stand. While there are many reasons to be discouraged and even tired here in Alberta these days, there are also so many examples of people standing up and creating community to fight back against the worst of what this government is trying to do. Just yesterday, I was very encouraged to be working with 2 activists in Red Deer who decided to stage a protest in response to the K6 curriculum. 2 moms, 2 workers, 2 Albertans who reached thousands of people through media yesterday with a little bit of extra time and grit and energy. And that's what it takes to get the job done. And this is just the beginning of the fight back through PIA and our partners at the Arusha Center. We've been finding each other and waking up slowly to the reality or the nightmare of this government. And now we see more and more communities standing together. More and more, we're hearing Albertans talk out loud about how enough is enough. And it's very exciting to hear and to see. And it's absolutely necessary that we do this work because the alternative is unacceptable right now. So my commitment tonight and going forward with PIA is to work my ass off to fight back against the worst that this government has to offer. But also I commit to working just as hard with you all and everyone in this province to build an alternative that looks beyond the defensive and beyond the election cycles that we find ourselves so often caught in, and beyond settling for the best of what's around. Because we know that when we fight, we win, and when we organize, we win. And in that organizing, we're actually building and practicing the kind of communities that we want to live in and leave for our children and our young ones in this province. Leaders in our movements, like Kshama, have shown us what it takes to show up to the fight and to win. It's much harder for us. In fact, we know we have to work at least 3 times as hard to win, but we know that we can. And so often, you know, in our movements, we're told that we have to wait, that now is not the time, and that we can't let perfection be the enemy of the good. But I think that the hardest fights are the ones most worth waging. So that's why I'm here today, to listen, to learn, and to connect with you all and to organize. So please check out pialberta.org. I'll get that right when I start, I promise. And get involved today. Thank you so much for being here. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce my new colleague, Laura Cruz, our communications officer, and someone who's been wearing many hats for the past several weeks as acting ED of PIA. Thanks for making time to be a part of it, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Brad. And we're so excited to have you joining us. We know that it's going to be a really amazing time with you at the leadership of this organization. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Kshama Sawant. So Kashama is not a career politician. She is an activist who brings a passion for social justice to her work as a public servant. As a member of the City Council, Kshama pledges to be a voice for workers, youth, the oppressed, and the voiceless. She only accepts the average worker's wage and donates the rest of her 6-figure salary to building social justice movements. Alongside being a teacher, Kshama is an activist, organizer, and socialist, and is a member of Socialist Alternative in solidarity with the Committee for a Workers' International, which organizes for working class interests on every continent. Growing up in India, Kshama was always conscious of extreme poverty and the inequality surrounding her. After working as a computer engineer, she came to the US to study economics in order to better understand the root causes of oppression and poverty. Upon arriving in the US, the richest country in the world, Kshama was surprised and radicalized by the inequality and poverty that exists here. After earning her PhD, Kshama moved to Seattle and began teaching at Seattle Central Community College, Seattle University, and the University of Washington, Tacoma. She joined Socialist Alternative in 2006, and since then has helped to organize demonstrations for marriage equality, participated in the movement to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was a visible presence in the Occupy movement. Kshama has also been an activist in her union, the American Federation of Teachers, Local 1789, fighting against budget cuts and tuition hikes. In 2012, Kshama ran as a Socialist Alternative candidate for Washington State Legislature and surprised everyone by winning 29% of the vote. The momentum continued to her campaign for Seattle City Council, where she boldly ran on a platform of fighting for a $15 minimum wage, rent control, and taxing the super rich to fund mass transit and education. She defeated 16-year incumbent Democrat to become the first socialist elected in a major US city in decades. Welcome, Kshama.
Thank you so much, Laura, and good evening, everyone. We live in an era of unprecedented crisis, not only the pandemic, but of course, the long-term crisis of capitalism. The Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and the solidarity protests globally captured the mass anger against racism and police violence, but also gave expression to the larger frustrations of entire generations who can see that this system is not working for them. 43 million Americans hold over $1.6 trillion in student debt. More than 30% of borrowers are either in default, late on payments, or have stopped making them 6 years after graduation. Rental debt is staggering at the same time, with 12 million Americans carrying an average rental debt of close to $6,000. And they stare into what is going to be a tsunami of evictions unless there's a mass fight back. And anger at this crisis is coming to the fore with increasing calls to cancel rental debt. Collins Dictionary declared climate strike as the word of 2019. It's no surprise considering that millions of people, overwhelmingly young, have participated worldwide in the various climate strikes. The questions facing us in terms of the climate crisis connect directly to the capitalist system that, as we have seen, has failed to even address the COVID pandemic. And we've just seen in Alberta, as you all know better than I do, the workers whose lives are being lost to COVID-19 in the slaughterhouse and Red Deer, and with Premier Kenney shamelessly blaming the South Asian community for a second wave, which of course profit-driven corporations are responsible for. And it was only action by the labor movement that they were able to expose the dangerous workplace conditions and at least have a temporary shutdown. In this global historic context, the Democratic Party in the United States has gained control over the entire federal government. The Democratic-controlled US Congress and the Biden administration have passed a substantial COVID relief package. Biden has made public statements supportive of the Amazon union effort by workers in Bessemer, Alabama, of the kind that are virtually unheard of by any US president. And in many ways, this is unusual, especially compared to the decades of assault on working people's living standards, on unions, and on public programs. It shows the tremendous pressure that the Democratic Party is under, both with the expectation of ordinary people that this new administration needs to stand in contrast to the disastrous and reactionary Trump regime, and because of the sheer depth and scale of the crisis of their own system that they are now going to be presiding over. We're seeing this play out in other countries, including Canada as well, with the capitalist representatives in the governments of various nations taking steps to address the crisis of their own system, and the institutions of global capitalism like the International Monetary Fund calling on Western governments to take steps, even including raising taxes on corporations. But what we're going to see is, while certainly carrying out a COVID relief package, like for example, in the US, the Democratic establishment will not use their majorities to actually fight for ordinary people, let alone solve the climate catastrophe that stares us in the face, and will once more carry out a pro-corporate agenda and fail to resolve the compounded crisis facing most of America. We already saw Biden capitulate on even the rare promise he had made to working people, raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. Calls to cancel student debt have grown as Democrats took control of both halls of Congress and the White House, but Biden reneged on this other promise also, where he made a promise to cancel up to $10,000 of federal loans. And in fact, the Democrats have even refused to extend the payment freeze on student loans, let alone canceling any student debt. Biden re-entered the United States into the Paris Climate Accord to much pomp and fanfare in the media. But as scientists pointed out, even when it was signed in 2016, the Paris Accord was a completely inadequate framework. A Green New Deal jobs program funded by taxing Wall Street would have a real impact on fossil fuel emissions and would be a tremendously popular move, and in fact would help to win over many Republican voters who don't agree yet. But as a big business party, the Democrats are not prepared to do any such thing. And it's important to note, just weeks ago, it was reported by the Guardian newspaper that the world's biggest 60 banks have provided nearly $4 trillion of financing for fossil fuel companies since the Paris climate deal. It is shocking, though it should not be surprising to us, that despite the COVID pandemic cutting energy use dramatically, overall funding for fossil fuel production remains on an upward trend, and the finance provided in 2020 was higher than in 2016 or 2017. Given the deep and overarching crisis of the capitalist system and its ongoing ravages on the planet and on the lives of the masses, and in light of the threat of right populism with growing anger at and disenchantment with corporate politics, it is extremely important that the left urgently build mass movement and also develop political strategy, and international conversations like this one are important. For example, the fact that the self-described socialist or left US Congress members were unable to have a winning strategy on a federal $15 minimum wage, as we recently saw, this is motivating more and more young people to understand how our Socialist Council office in Seattle was able to win the $15 minimum wage. And in many ways, the socialist alternative-led work in Seattle offers an idea of the kind of politics and strategy we will need to win any kind of substantial change. We need movements to understand the need to break from capitalism, understand that billionaires are not on our side, neither are the politicians and bureaucrats who make careers out of passing minimal reforms while maintaining the status quo of a deeply dysfunctional system. This is the kind of leadership we need in mass movements, and we don't have that right now for the most part. And that's why our movements will need our own independent political organizations. Otherwise, we will be condemned to be stuck in the hamster wheel of corporate and pro-capitalist politics. In the US, there are differences between the Democratic and Republican parties. The defeat of Trump by the majority of American voters was a historic repudiation of his reactionary, anti-worker, anti-immigrant, anti-woman, climate change denying billionaire agenda. But Trump leaving office, we know, does not mean that the threat of the far right is neutralized. In fact, far from it. The Democrats and Republicans serve the same masters: Wall Street, big business, the wealthy, corporate landlords, and fossil fuel billionaires, big corporations, the capitalist class. We need a new party of and for and by working people. And in our view, the need for a new party for working people and young people is tied to the need for our movements to use the strategy of class struggle when we get elected to the legislatures under capitalism. And of course, as I'm sure everybody knows, by class struggle, I mean that the working class as a whole, those of us who need to earn a living by having a job, have a common interest in uniting for progressive change, and that the millionaires and billionaires, on the other hand, have a common interest of their own in maintaining the status quo, maintaining capitalism. Democratic bodies of governance under capitalism are set up to defend the interests of the elite. So here, for example, the Democratic and Republican parties together have for decades secured a relatively stable rule by occasionally allowing minor reforms to be won through elected officials from time to time as a kind of safety valve, while at the same time presiding over massive inequalities and poverty. And the reason they give minor reforms is because they want to prevent sharper clashes and they want to sustain illusions in the system. So the task of a socialist and working class representative is twofold. One is to show how to win substantial reforms that will be fiercely opposed by the ruling class, show how to win them by building movements independent of the establishment. And this is important because mass movements independent of the democratic establishment in the US, for example, are the only factor that can change the otherwise ruthless status quo of the balance of forces. The other politicians have the wealthy and the might of the entire system on their side. Whom are you going to have on your side as an elected representative of working people? If you do not have a socialist organization and a working class movement on your side, you are going to be marginalized. And the second task is to expose the limits of reformism itself, that is the limits to only advocating for reforms, as hard as they will be to win, and not for fundamental change. To explain to working people the need to break from capitalism itself and for the need for socialism if we are to address the crises facing humanity, the need for a classless society based on solidarity and equality. Socialist Alternative, the organization that I'm a part of, as Laura mentioned, it takes this view towards politics, and we are in solidarity with Socialist Alternative Canada, members of whom are present at this meeting today. And in fact, we are part of an international movement because capitalism is a global system, and we believe we have to have an international movement of working people. Socialist Alternative has used a class struggle approach starting from our first city council campaign in 2013. We clearly named who our opponents are: big business, the capitalist class, and the two major parties, both of whom serve the interests of the bosses. As was mentioned, I take home only the average worker's wage and donate the rest after taxes to a solidarity fund. And what we've seen in Seattle is that the only party with any power is the Democratic Party. There isn't a Republican stronghold at all in Seattle, and has never been, as far as I know. And still, an overwhelming number of our movement's victories began with only one reliable vote on the council, mine, and ultimately passed unanimously or with supermajority votes only under pressure from our fighting council office and from the movements we have helped build. The $15 minimum wage victory saw the light of day only because we used our council position to launch the 15 Now campaign, along with progressive labor unions. This 15 Now campaign overcame not only the opposition of big business and the corporate Democrats, but also the cautious instincts of some labor leaders reluctant to openly clash with the establishment. The 15 Now campaign organized a series of mass action conferences, launched neighborhood action groups, held a series of marches, and then democratically decided to file a grassroots ballot initiative so that we could take the issue to the voters if Democratic City Council members failed to act. All of this, especially the ballot initiative tactic, was integral to forcing the hand of big business and the establishment. We're not going to win a federal $15 an hour minimum wage, let alone a strong one without insidious loopholes, unless mass movements are built, and it will not be won by elected representatives using parliamentary tricks or technocratic knowledge, and it will not be because of collegiality with politicians who represent opposing class interests. We won the Amazon tax last year, which taxes large corporations like Amazon to fund affordable social housing and Green New Deal projects. Again, the Tax Amazon movement was organized independently of the city's Democratic politicians, though they were invited to speak and represent their views. None of them did. We organized, again, a series of mass action conferences that involved hundreds of working people, where all major decisions of the movement were democratically debated and voted on. Despite fierce big business opposition and repeated ploys by city and state Democrats to derail it, the movement won during the height of the Black Lives Matter street protests, primarily on the powerful support we got in the protests and on the basis of a viable ballot initiative threat similar to 15 Now. In addition, we won a whole series of renters' rights that were thought of as impossible. Most importantly, every victory we have won has been a product of our class struggle-based fighting strategy, where we know the political establishment is not on the side of working people. Because of the influence of our socialist politics, the Democratic Party, which controls the city, has been forced to adapt itself away from the overtly corporate politicians whose campaigns were openly funded by big business and who in turn brazenly defended corporate interests. Now, there is a new crop of politicians who call themselves progressive Democrats who don't take any money from big business or corporate landlords and who use progressive rhetoric in their speech. This is a positive development because it represents how socialists and working people's movements have transformed our city's politics. But what has not fundamentally changed is the class interests these politicians represent. 5 years ago, I was the only elected representative who was, believe it or not, who was willing to publicly say Black Lives Matter. Now every politician in Seattle says it, sometimes with tears in their eyes. But that did not stop the progressive Democrats from voting for a racist police contract in 2018 or voting for hiring bonuses for police officers the year after, or to backtrack on their promises to defund the police by 50%. They were forced to approve the Amazon tax, which the tax Amazon won in solidarity with BLM. They were forced to vote yes on our ban of police use of weapons like tear gas and rubber bullets. They were forced to do all these things because of the strength of our movements. But shortly after the summer protests subsided, they reneged on all their promises. They gutted the ban on weapons like tear gas, and state Democrats started talking once again about phasing out the Amazon tax. All of this shows we urgently need more socialists and working class representatives in office, but it is simply not about just a numerical increase. It is about much more than that. It is about electing representatives who are clear-eyed about what they are doing and how to withstand the pressures of office and understand what a fighting strategy really looks like. Events have proven how it will not be enough to tweet for elected officials to tweet support for an issue or criticize Republicans or introduce a progressive legislation like Medicare for all or vote a different way than establishment politicians. Those things are necessary, of course, but they will simply not be enough. In Congress, it will not be enough to introduce a Medicare for all bill. We will need a serious strategy to actually win Medicare for all based on mobilizing millions of working people behind it and being prepared, having elected representatives who are prepared to clash with the Democratic Party leadership. And that's why we will need elected representatives who don't just vote differently, which is crucial, but they will need to base themselves on the working class movement that includes raising consciousness by exposing the betrayals of the establishment, including progressive Democrats, and providing an alternative way forward, and by showing how to win victories because of that alternative way. They will have to clarify, for example, that the reason progressive Democrats in Congress accepted removing the federal $15 minimum wage from the stimulus bill is not really about parliamentary restrictions or legal concerns as they claimed, but because they did not want to go up against big business and powerful Democrats like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, and because they were reluctant to use their elected office to build mass movements, to bring the relentless pressure to bear that is needed to win these things. And if and when you relentlessly fight for working people, the ruling class and their political machine will retaliate against you. It's no surprise that we now have a recall campaign against our office. The recall has 4 charges, and now 3 charges. The Supreme Court threw out one of those charges. But all of these charges claim that I broke the law in some way or another. In fact, one of the charges says I broke the law by letting in Black Lives Matter activists into City Hall. Another claims I used public resources for a ballot initiative. All the charges are false. I did not break the law. But that does not matter as far as the Washington state law on recalling elected officials is concerned, which is set up to be deeply undemocratic. The law, for example, does not require the charges to be true. It only requires that the charges be stated properly. And what this campaign is really about, this recall campaign is really about, is wealthy people and the political establishment who were not able to defeat our re-election in 2019, wanting a do-over. Some of the billionaires behind the campaign have actually donated to both Biden and to the Republicans. And we have to understand the recall is not against me as an individual because they just don't like my personality. I mean, they say those things, but that's not what it's about. It's an attack on left movements and working people as a whole. They want to send a message. If you ordinary people dare to fight, if you actually have the temerity to use an elected legislative office to fight for marginalized communities and against the rich, we will come after you. It is no accident that 2 of the 4 recall charges, the now 3 recall charges, are retaliation against me for having fought alongside BLM movement. It's a retaliation against BLM as a whole. This is the latest and the most egregious attack on our office, but it is hardly the first one. Ever since we took office in 2014, big business and the Democratic establishment figured out that they can neither bully us nor marginalize us. They cannot get us to be loyal to establishment discipline. So then big business and the right wing file lawsuit after lawsuit against us. I've lost count now. Numerous ethics complaints, including some ethics complaints for our office using the City Hall printer and copier for making leaflets and posters to build our movements, which we do proudly. None of these attacks has deterred us in any way. Then Seattle's big business and billionaire class and also the Democratic establishment went all out against us in 2019 in their attempt to get us out of City Hall in the re-election campaign. They spent huge sums of money, sent any number of mailers with sexist, racist, and xenophobic attacks. Amazon alone threw down $1 million money bomb in the last weeks of the election. But it wasn't just Amazon and the billionaires. 2 of the Latina progressive Democratic council members themselves, in coordination with some labor leaders, ran their own candidate against our office in the primary election in 2019. They told stories to the media of how they supposedly agreed with the policies my office stood for, but that I did not know how to work with others. We do, of course, work with Democratic politicians where we agree on a common goal on an issue that is in the interest of the working class, but my office will never adopt the mutual career climbing backdoor negotiation approach that they base themselves on, and that's what they're really angry about. These personalized attacks on our office are based in falsehood, but we should expect, this is internationally true, we should expect that such attacks will be used ruthlessly against our movements. Having been in office for 7.5 years as an independent socialist, I can attest to the real pressure, and the pressure is unrelenting, the pressure to bend to the corporate politics of the establishment. This is often indirectly expressed as a demand to be quote unquote civil to your quote unquote colleagues on the legislative body. There's no question these pressures are real and the conflict is challenging. But we should be crystal clear. We did not win our victories in Seattle by my office going along to get along or refusing to expose the Democrats and put them on the spot. The great Irish socialist James Connolly once said, the role of a socialist in elected office is to be a disturber of the political peace. This is not because as socialists, we love being the wrench in the works. It is because the whole machinery of capitalism is designed to crush working people, to crush marginalized communities and dehumanize them. There's no way to stand against that machinery while being part of the club. The task of working class elected representatives is to help win every possible victory for the working class, for oppressed communities, for women, and to lay the groundwork for future class struggle, which is what they're really angry about. You know, the example of successful movement building. In fact, just today on the CBC website, there is an article that says, is now the time to tax big business. And the photo that they have in that article is from the Tax Amazon movement. All of this shows that we urgently need a new party for working people and for the fight against oppression in this country, a new party that will base its strength on organizing movements on local demands, and also nationally for winning Medicare for all, for canceling renter and student debt, and for a massive green jobs and infrastructure program funded by taxing the millionaires and the billionaires. And Canada itself has an inspiring example that we often use to explain the need to build working class parties independent of the establishment. I mean, the Canadian healthcare system, it had its beginnings in the workers' parties independent of the establishment that were built in the 50s and 60s, which led the way. And without that, we would not have had the healthcare system that the US is still lagging decades behind on. At its core, all of these fights, whether it is to win a decent healthcare system, let alone socialized medicine, the fight to cancel student debt, the fight to cancel rental and other COVID debt, the fight for the planet's survival itself against climate catastrophe, let alone for a world where all of us human beings can thrive. All of this is a fight against the capitalist system itself that places its bottom line over its people. The capitalist bosses and their spokespeople, their politicians, their media, they want to preserve capitalism at all costs. This dysfunctional system that is enriching billionaires during a pandemic when people are dying and even essential frontline workers are struggling to pay for their needs in this, the richest country in the world. Working people and the oppressed, the youth, those of us who have a vision of social justice, we, on the other hand, need a completely different society, a new society, a socialist society, a society free of exploitation, sexism, and racism, an environmentally sustainable society. The simple truth is we cannot control what we don't own. The international working class will have to start by fighting to take the top corporations like Amazon and fossil fuel companies and the energy conglomerates into democratic public ownership so that we can retool them for the good of humanity and the planet, to end the use of fossil fuels and harness technology for the good of all humanity, not for the exploitation of the billions, for the endless greed of the billionaires. There is a deep and irreconcilable divide between these two visions. So given this chasm, we should expect that when we get organized, and especially when we win victories and we empower other ordinary people like ourselves, that the wealthy will attack us with all their might. But we know we simply cannot afford to go backward. In this time of deep crisis for working people, we need the socialist movement to go forward, become far stronger. We need the labor movement to go forward and become stronger and to help raise the confidence and consciousness of the working class about its own power. Already we have seen through the growth of right populism why it is so crucial and urgent to build a socialist left, a multiracial working class international socialist left as a powerful counter to the dangerous ideas of right populism and as an alternative to the bankruptcy of corporate liberalism. And that is why it is so crucial that not only right now in the US, we defeat this right-wing and big business backed recall attack, but it's so crucial that we build international solidarity among the working class and build militant labor movements and labor struggles, which are going to be necessary, whether it is about addressing the problems of poverty, or it is about really making sure that the planet averts climate catastrophe. So, and I'm so delighted that I was able to be part of this discussion. I'm looking forward to the question and answer and the input that I receive from you all as well. And I look forward to working alongside you all. Thank you. Solidarity.
Thank you so much, Kshama, really for sharing with us the substantive meaning of socialism as a movement more for equity and diffuse justice. I mean, here in Alberta, the sort of antiquated rhetoric of socialism as this sort of McCarthy era scary trapping is still very strong with us. And so it's so great to be able to point to active, meaningful policies and actions that people are taking to improve the lives of the working class and help to break down some of those confusions around the meetings. Before we go into the Q&A section really quick, we just wanted to provide you all with a bit of a Canadian context. We have Leslie, who's joined us from Socialist Alternative in BC, and Leslie's just going to share very quickly a bit around their experience in party and movement building here in Canada and on the West. So Leslie, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Jared. And yeah, it's always a pleasure to hear Kshama speak. That determination is something we can all learn from. So as Jared said, I'm with Socialist Alternative Canada. We're a young and growing organization. We have branches, 2 branches in BC, branch in Ontario, and several members and prospective members in Alberta and in others in other parts of Canada. So it's really good to be here. I'm originally from Alberta and I follow what's going on in Alberta with great interest. And with Jason Kenney, Alberta is now one of the most explosive places in Canada, if not the most explosive. And Terry mentioned in his opening that this government has given us a lot to do. And Brad said, that Kenney is hell-bent on cutting services. And we know that he has an appalling record of not supporting health workers. In fact, firing a bunch of health workers, thousands of health workers in the middle of a pandemic, and also not supporting ordinary people during this pandemic. Somebody referred to Alberta as a land of dinosaurs. I mean, there is a lot of dinosaurs, bones in Alberta. But I want to just mention that, the Alberta government has actually betrayed workers in the oil and gas industry and in other sectors as well. We in Socialist Alternative reject the false division of workers versus the environment that's often put up by, both, people like Jason Kenney, but also, sometimes on the environmental movements. And we know that we need to create jobs that actually create a better environment for all of us. And there's no shortage of them. If you think about, construction, climate-friendly buildings and renovating, building mass transit, our transportation system across Canada is really appalling. So all of these would provide really good quality jobs for workers at the same time, building the decaying infrastructure. And so we need to be developing and exploring other alternatives besides oil and gas. And an example of the betrayal is the depletion of the heritage fund that Alberta set up. The Alberta Heritage Trust Fund. They set up this fund years ago under Peter Lougheed, and it's been really depleted by past governments and the current government. And Norway, which actually developed its own version of the Heritage Trust Fund, was years after Alberta, yet it's growing, and it will see Norway into a much more prosperous future. But, you know, it's so encouraging to hear about the fight back in Alberta. I'm going to say just a little about SA Canada is an active campaigning organization. We also are involved in the Fight for 15, inspired by the movement in Seattle and across the US. And our members campaigned vigorously for 2 years in Alberta, in BC, to actually win a $15 minimum wage, working with the BC Federation of Labor and convincing them initially to move up their demands from $12 an hour to $15, and then campaigning week in, week out on the streets. We've also been active in other things, like in PEI. We've helped to build a tenants movement. And Vancouver, we've been trying to address the housing crisis and focusing on taxing the rich, and working to elect to prevent progressive councillor Jean Swanson, who we were successful in helping to win a seat on Vancouver City Council. And she's been a fighter also for many of the issues that you know, we stand for in terms of taxing the rich, building housing, supporting tenants, etc. So the pandemic has revealed the deficits of capitalism and its focus on increasing wealth of a few, with the vast majority of humanity actually having decreasing wealth and income. And during the pandemic, we've seen many more billionaires have become even wealthier. So we've also been supporting workers in the hospitality industry who've been brutally affected by the pandemic. It's called BC's Unequal Women Campaign, and they're representing mainly women of color and immigrants, some who've worked for decades in hotels and have been fired en masse by the very wealthy hotels. And we are proud to have a number of our members working on a boycott campaign, and it's having some success, but it's still a big struggle ahead. So I think it's important for us, for ordinary people, working people, to recognize how far the struggles have been pushed back in the past decades of neoliberal policies. And I'm just going to quote from a statement from the Alberta NDP that I came across. It was written in 1974, and this is just part of it. And it's talking about women, but it's the liberation of women must be a vital part of the struggle for socialism in Canada. The struggle for liberation is not a struggle to gain for women the equal right to be exploited in the manner that the majority of men in a capitalist society are exploited. The demands are not simply for equal wages and equal job opportunities, but for the end to a system which requires passive, obedient, and low-paid workers in order to function. Now, I'm not sure the NDP would be making a statement like that today, but I think it's a reflection of the neoliberal narrative that has dominated discourse over the past decades. Less government is best, reducing taxes on corporations. You know, and this is still the dominant narrative from leaders such as Jason Kenney, but it's increasingly being challenged. The tide is turning. More people are realizing the failings of capitalism, how capitalism has been a disaster for the environment, and how it has contributed significantly to climate change. However, we still have work to do in pointing out that there is an alternative to capitalism, and that is our task as Socialist Alternative Canada. And we want to join with others in progressive politics to fight for a better world. We welcome people who share our politics and our determination to build a socialist alternative to the rotten system that is capitalism. So I encourage you to check out our website And feel free to contact, yeah, Bill's already put up our website in the chat. So please check us out. We've got lots of articles on current issues as well as some international ones. So solidarity, all of you.
Thanks so much, Leslie, for providing that context and for pointing people to where they can find more information about Socialist Alternative Canada. I'm really excited to delve into that myself. So from what I understand, people are not able to access a chat box. So we're going to, I'm just going to ask a question right now to kind of ground what Kshama was talking about in the Albertan context. And then we can open it up to what other people want to know about. So please put your questions into the chat and we'll try to figure out a way to get through them. So Kshama, Kevin Taft, who was a prominent former Albertan politician, wrote in his 2017 book, Oil's Deep State, that the petroleum industry, this is a quote here, the petroleum industry in Canada has captured so many democratic institutions that it has blocked the capacity of the governments of Alberta and Canada to effectively address global warming. That's the end of the quote. And I would add, and issues such as, economic diversification in our province that's been so dominated by this one industry. So I was wondering if you could please tell us about how big business, such as Amazon, like you were mentioning, has captured democratic institutions in Seattle and America more broadly. And could you tell us about how you organized to defeat those candidates and what lessons that Albertans who live in a state dominated by extractive industries can learn from you?
Sure, I can add a few thoughts to that, but and I'm not sure what your format is, but I wonder if you could maybe others also wanted to add to it. I know Leslie and Bill from Socialist Alternative Canada, I think, can also add to this discussion because one of the things in response to your question, I think it needs to be highlighted that the only reason that we have won any victories. And as you mentioned, Laura, going up against, for example, Amazon with the second richest man in the world and a corporation with $1 trillion footprint. I mean, I want to come to your question about, how did that happen in the first place? But the very fact that we were able to go up against such powerful adversaries and win on top of that, I think it needs to be crystal clear in the minds of everybody who's watching this is that it's not about, specifically me or my personal qualities. I mean, obviously the personal qualities of leaders and their willingness to take on the clash with the establishment is going to be super critical. And so in that sense, having leaders who are rooted in social movements and who are, and especially in our case, I think it is very crucial that we need leaders who are very clear about why we are socialists and what that means, what it means to go up against the forces of capitalism. But at the end of the day, the only way we can go up against such powerful forces and win on top of that is because we have a very very effective organization in Socialist Alternative. And Leslie described some of the things about what Socialist Alternative Canada organizes around. And I think that it will be a disservice to the seriousness of the discussion if I didn't really emphasize that point, that we cannot have, first of all, cult of personality politics. We have to have politics that understands that the ideas are at the center, and on top of that, we need leaders who will fight for those ideas and remain accountable to the interests that they say that they represent. So yes, leadership absolutely matters. And I think it's also a mistake on the other end for a lot of young people who may draw understandably wrong conclusions that, because, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, despite 26 million people being on the streets, the victories that were won by the movement were not commensurate to the strength of the protests. Why is that? And sometimes people might conclude, oh, that means we should have no leaders. No, some ideas are going to be dominating any movement. So the question is, will they be the ideas that will actually deliver these victories for the people who are struggling? Or they are going to be ideas that sell them down the road and once again co-opt the movements? I think that's the question that needs to be posed. And so we will need leaders who will fight for those correct ideas. And I think a bottom line, the reason we have been able to go up against these big corporations is because we launched this campaign in the first place for city council election as a part of socialist alternatives, socialist alternatives idea and vision that actually there's an openness to not only left politics, but working class and socialist politics, and to put that to the test. And to be honest with you, when we first ran, we did not even have the idea that we would win. We just wanted to prove that there is an opening for left politics. And we did win. And then after winning in the 7 years in office, over 7 years in office, we have shown how to use that office. And so, Amazon and corporations like them, the fact that they are so huge, it really show, and also the fact that as poverty has been, has been intensified for a whole section of humanity, at the same time, billionaires are more in number. In my home country, India, we have more billionaires than we had 5 years ago. All of that points to the fundamental nature of capitalism itself, and it also shows why in the pandemic, billionaires have become over $1 trillion richer in America, but there's been an unprecedented devastation of small businesses. I know that's true in Alberta and Canada as a whole as well, the destruction of small businesses. All of this shows that it is in the nature of capitalism itself to consolidate wealth upon consolidated wealth upon consolidated wealth. And that's why you see how you have big corporations like Amazon. And also at the same time, as the quote that you read indicated, Laura, that that wealth also translates into political clout. So there is no universe where you can have political influence for the working class without taking on the might of big business. And how we take them on, that I think that what we have shown is an example of how that can be done if you have powerful working class organizations that are clear about politics. And I think that's another thing. I mean, we would not have won any of the victories we won, like the Amazon tax, for example, unless we had the incredible self-sacrifice of thousands of people who really went out to campaign to educate other working people on these ideas. But it was, and that was important, but all of the organizational work that Socialist Alternative does rests on our political clarity about what demands to raise, what do we think is going to capture the imagination of working people, and what will bring them out to the stage of history, and what are the tactics and strategy we need to employ. I'll just end on one point, is that when we had already launched the Tax Amazon movement when the Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd movement broke out nationally in the summer. And at that time, there were many NGO and other leaders who are very tied to the Democratic Party who strongly argued, in our view, completely wrongly, that the Amazon tax to fund social housing is not a Black issue. We should only be talking about police brutality. We did not agree with them at all, but we said, look, let's put the ideas to the test. Let's go to a mass of working people and see what they say. They will tell us, they will give us the message, whether they're ready to fight for this or not. And it was incredible, as I mentioned before, it was incredible the kind of support the Tax Amazon movement had. And in fact, the ballot initiative that we had, which was the single most important reason we were able to force the Democrats into passing the Amazon tax, that ballot initiative got 30,000 signatures as a whole, and that 20,000 out of those 30,000 signatures were collected at the protest in the first 20 days. That's how powerful, 1,000 signatures a day. We could not give the clipboards fast enough for people to be able to sign them. And because working people understand racism is very much a product of this system that also subjects us to this economic injustice, and hell yeah, let's tax Amazon was the response.
Thank you, Kshama. I believe you kind of have already answered this question, but I just wanted to ask it for Allison. One of the viewers has asked, in your campaign to win a seat on City Council, what strategies did you use to gain voters who may not identify as socialists? And I might take it a step further to say who are even opposed to ideas of socialism. Were you able to capture any of those people who maybe consider themselves antithetical to socialist ideals? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, one thing we have to recognize, and especially in the American context, I think it's important to recognize that there was a time, and I think one of you mentioned this earlier, that when there was this Cold War demonization and vilification of the word socialism itself. First of all, we have to recognize. I mean, I don't mean to imply in any way that now there's broad agreement on what exactly socialism means and that the majority of America identifies as socialist. I don't think we're there yet. But what we should recognize is that it is no longer the situation of the Cold War. I mean, entire generations have, were born well after that era, and their experience is that this system currently is not working for them, and there is a real search for alternatives, and that may not always be expressed very, very clearly in terms of capitalism and socialism. They may not have read political text or participated in meetings where there is political analysis, but there is an understanding that this system does not work. And furthermore, that the Democratic and Republican parties are clearly not working for us. And that kind of clarity, we saw that was there, and we saw that in the Occupy movement, which we had participated in and helped lead in 2011. And it was on the basis of that we ran our campaigns. We decided we were going to call ourselves socialists. But what we did was we explained what that meant. That what does a socialist candidate do? What would a socialist elected representative do? And we concretized it. And so some of the points have already come up. The question of taking the average worker's wage, raising the demands of $15 an hour, taxing big business, and for rent control. All of these demands concretely spoke to the needs of ordinary people. And what we did also was take political education of working people seriously, meaning on the news, they constantly heard bad things about, $15 an hour would be nothing less than apocalypse, economic apocalypse in the city. We countered all of that. And in fact, we were the only ones who countered it. The Democrats did nothing to counter it. In fact, they helped the kind of confusion on $15 an hour, but we boldly talked about how there's no basis for it. And furthermore, if the system is so fragile that it cannot sustain $15 an hour, then what kind of system are we defending? Like, what exactly are we defending here? We need 15 and more. And those arguments were very powerful to people. It was concretely explaining what all of that means and what accountability to us means. That the reception we got, whether we had won ultimately or not, one thing was decisive from the very beginning. The reception we got for our ideas was so decisive that calling ourselves socialists was not in any way a barrier to us. And in fact, one incident I'll share in closing is there was one time when I was standing behind our campaign table, and I saw this older woman looking at me, and I thought, oh, she's going to talk about how socialism is bad. And when she came up to me, she said, "Are you for real?" And what she meant was, are you really a socialist who is running for office and going to fight for $15 an hour? Are you really saying that you will take home only the average worker's wage and not take home the lavish salary? That's the impact it had on people, that, wow, we have never seen a campaign like this. And I think we should not, I mean, obviously we should not have rose tinted glasses about what lies ahead. I think it is going to be a massive struggle, but also on the other hand, we should not make the mistake of thinking that people are not ready for fighting politics.
Thank you, Kshama. I believe, just really quickly before we go to the next question, that Bill from Socialist Alternative in Vancouver was hoping that he could just add a little bit to that. So Bill, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very quickly. Thank you, everybody. Kshama said about clipboards flying out of your hands. We did a lot of work around $15 minimum wage. And any working class communities where we set up our table out on the street and said, fight for a $15 minimum wage, the most common reaction was, that's not enough with the rents in Vancouver. It wasn't, oh my God, we can't afford it. You talk to some of the union bureaucrats, they're going, well, that's a bit extreme, the boss won't like it. Since when did we build unions by asking the boss what he likes? Similarly, like in the housing thing, our two main slogans was rent freeze and tax the rich to build houses. And again, you know, people are like at a shopping and they're talking to their kids and they don't look at you. And then suddenly, 2 seconds later, what you said registers in their brain and they turn around, they come back and say, hell yes, I want to sign that. You know, and I think those sort of slogans, like Alberta, it's like jobs and environment, because Kenny is giving you neither. He's destroying your environment and he's destroying jobs at record paces, you know. Kshama mentioned about public health. Did Tommy Douglas and the CCF go and ask the doctors and for Big Pharma what they wanted and say, okay, so this is, we'll go halfway between what Big Pharma wants and what ordinary Saskatchewan people want? No, they said, so ordinary Saskatchewan people need public health. And we'll fight the doctors tooth and nail, and we'll fight Big Pharma tooth and nail to win it. And that's what they did. Unfortunately, our NDP now goes, I'm reading a book by Seth Klein on the environment, and he makes the point, he went to talk to NDPers in BC, Alberta, and everywhere, and they all say, well, we have to keep big business on side. Well, if you keep big business on side, you're frying the planet. And I think that's, to me, that's what Kshama's lesson is. You either have working people on your side or you listen to big business. And if you listen to big business, you ain't going to change society. We kind of would have never got public health. We wouldn't have got a $15 minimum wage. And that's what, and I don't live in Alberta, but I'm sure the same slogans, type of slogans, would go down really powerfully in Alberta. Thanks.
Thanks for that additional context, Bill. Another question that relates to our context here in Alberta. So Alberta had a brief respite from decades of conservative rule when the new Democratic Party won in 2015. So while the Alberta NDP did contribute very positive directions, such as a $15 minimum wage in our province, and pilot projects for affordable childcare, many of us in progressive advocacy and activism felt that they definitely didn't go far enough. And they also tried to appeal to center-right voters in the following election, which left a lot of people feeling very disconnected from the party. So you've certainly been attacked by the right and big business, but you have also experienced attacks from establishment Democrats. Can you tell us about how the political establishment is unsupportive and adversarial to bold ideas and campaigns? You mentioned that the two parties serve the same masters. And again, how do you overcome that hostility?
I think a lot of the sort of the crux of the response to this question goes back to one of the points that that Bill just made. You know, did Tommy Douglas go to Big Pharma or whatever, to, you know, the industry billionaires and so on, to for them to agree to have social healthcare in Canada? No, he went to the workers, and it was forming a workers' party that actually led to this major reform in Canada. And I think ultimately that is also what we have seen play out locally as well. And in fact, just on, you know, at the outset, I think it's important to clarify also that especially in the United States, but perhaps a little more now internationally as well, a lot of people who support the Democratic Party say, well, you know, they can't deny the victories we won in Seattle. So they'll say, well, this is great, you did it in Seattle, and I'm sure you had something to do with winning 15 and the Amazon tax, but it's a city that has a progressive city council, and you certainly can't do this in the halls of Congress, where you have such, you know, sort of vicious right wing and also very conservative Democrats. In reality, though, if you look at what we've had to do on the ground, as Laura, you were alluding to, in fact, even the progressive Democrats, you know, who call themselves progressive, they have ultimately been, you know, had to be dragged kicking and screaming for any of the victories we have won. And I can take example after example, but the Amazon tax is a good example because it was a major victory. And Ultimately, we got 7 out of the 9 council members to vote yes on it. But the way it was won was not that the city council has 1 socialist and 8 progressive Democrats. There's 9 council members, and that we discussed in congenial discussions, and then they all agreed this was the right thing to do. Absolutely not. In fact, if you look at the background of the Amazon tax struggle, it all started in 2017, in the autumn of 2017, when we, Socialist Alternative in our council office, we organized with many activists and rank and file labor union members to fight against the sweeps of homeless people, and then community members, and then we connected that to the need to tax big businesses like Amazon, but not just Amazon, obviously, to fund a major expansion of affordable social housing. And then we brought the environmental movement as well to support it, because we wanted funding for Green New Deal projects as well. And so how we deal with the Democrats has very much to do with how we prioritize creating and building unity in the grassroots on a principled basis. I thought Leslie had a very important example of this, that there is no hope of actually building mass movements to address climate change. And ultimately we are going to need to take the big corporations into democratic public ownership, but there's no hope of getting to that point unless we have a strategy to unite the millions of young people who are radicalizing on the climate issue and the workers in the fossil fuel sector. As Brad mentioned, we have to put forward the question of a just transition for the workers, and and the labor movement has to be integral to this. That's the approach we've used on every victory that we have won, building the unity among working people, and really pushing back against the divide and conquer approach that the ruling class uses at all times. And I think we have to also remember that the reason the progressive Democrats oppose all of these measures, even though they're constantly virtue signaling. I mean, you can't shut them up. They're always talking about how much they support this, that, or other progressive issue. But when it comes down to actually fighting for something, actually standing for something, that's where you see where somebody really stands, a politician really stands. And it was like Bill was saying, you can't support big business and working people's interests at the same time. Such a thing is not possible. Anybody who tells you that they can do that, they're lying to you, or they're lying to themselves, because those interests are opposed. It's a zero-sum game under capitalism. You cannot win victories for working people without wealthy people having to take a tiny hit. Not that they are going to be mired in poverty, but they're going to be opposed to any single gain that you will be fighting for, not only because they don't want to part with a penny of their profits that they create by exploiting workers, but also because, and this is what they're most afraid of, is the example of empowerment that spreads. And inevitably it does. I mean, we won $15 in Seattle. At that time, the Democrats, they were forced to vote yes on it. But then there was this whole narrative that, oh, we won it by having discussions with big business. And then also that, oh, this was just Seattle. But then what happened was the 15 Now movement went nationwide, and we won victories in many other cities, including Minneapolis. And of course, it also provided inspiration for struggles elsewhere. And we just heard about how incredibly, the movement did in Canada as well. So at the end of the day, because capitalists and the wealthy will have a fundamental opposition to any gains for working people, what that also means is that the halls of government under capitalism are also representing the interests of the capitalist state. And if you have a situation in Seattle, which is solely because of how we have become a factor in the city's politics, and we have forced the Democratic Party to reckon with us, reckon with socialist ideas, that is why they have had to adapt themselves. So there's been an exodus completely. There's not a single council member who was on the council when I was elected first is in office right now. There was literally an exodus of the pro-corporate politicians, and now you have these politicians who say one thing and then do another, but they speak quite differently, and it's confusing to people. But at the end of the day, this is what's important for us to remember, that those 8 progressive Democrats on the city council, at this moment in time, they have to represent the interests of capitalism in Seattle. So they are the representatives of the capitalist state. So at the end of the day, if we don't get that very fundamental reality, we will not understand why it is that they're not on our side, and why is it that we can't build unity with them. We cannot, because they're representing the interests of another class at all moments, regardless of how much they virtue signal. That is what they're doing. And that is why the only way we won, for example, the Amazon tax, is by creating momentum on the ground and forcing the Democrats to do something, because they were actually afraid, and big business was actually afraid, and they said this in public. They were afraid that if our ballot initiative went on the ballot and people actually voted on it, that they would win. I mean, I think they had the money to do the polls. They probably did opinion polls, and they figured out that we had huge support for the ballot initiative, and they wanted to avert that, and they made a concession. So in other words, our job is to wrest those concessions. Nothing is being given to us willingly. And that approach, I think, I mean, obviously the NDP, it's not a carbon copy, the NDP situation, but those are the fundamental ideas that I think that need to be used everywhere.
Thank you, Kshama. I think we'll just ask 2 more questions if that's okay. I know we started a little late, so I hope everyone's okay with that. And obviously no one's forced to stay. And just to clarify, we did have an issue enacting those subtitles, so apologies for that. Municipalities all over Alberta are headed into elections for city council this coming fall. What would be your advice to progressive advocates and activists on pushing their candidates to enact bold policies to support working class people?
First of all, don't buy into personality politics. Don't accept that anybody is above criticism. And at the end of the day, it shouldn't be about that candidate. It should be about the movement. And it's one thing if somebody is already running for office, then it's important that those people who are running for office, that they get organized with a larger group of people. And if they're willing to run on a clear platform of fighting demands and employ fighting strategies, then it's important that the labor movement, rank and file union labor, who are, part of this meeting here, Socialist Alternative in Canada, that we can actually, fight together. But ultimately, if there are candidates who are already running, then they have to be willing to be part of that broader organizing, because without that kind of, and I'm not even just calling it movements. Obviously, we need candidates who are rooted in wider movements, but it's not just a loose idea of movement. It's also about a concrete organization that has at least some kind of idea of what it is that the campaign should stand for, and then what does it mean to fight for it. I mean, I'll give you an example. There is a candidate running here for city council. They call themselves socialists, but when you look at how they're running their campaign, they are calling for taxing the rich and rent control on their website, but they never mention that in their public appearances, in their speeches. They are not using opportunities to put their politics forward. They have not participated in any of the struggles that we have generated. And in fact, just days ago, we won a major victory for renters. Despite the Democrats trying to completely isolate us, we were able to win the right for all tenants to have a lawyer present with them when they're facing eviction, which is a make or break. You can actually prevent evictions just by having a lawyer. So this candidate is not participating in any of those struggles, has not said anything publicly about anything. So I think that is, we need a flip side of that. Which, I mean, we need an opposite of that, which is that candidates who are running in Alberta right now, they need to participate. First of all, they need to have an organized approach where there are others with them, and that not only can they back them up, but also hold them accountable. But it's not just about vague ideas of accountability. It's about actually discussing what is the campaign program going to be, what are the things that we need to be raising, and what are the tactics we're going to use to win this campaign actually, right? What is the strategy to win? But also that these candidates should be active in the struggles that are ongoing right now. For example, if you had a candidate running in Red Deer, I'm not sure if there are or not, but the struggle that the labor movement had to wage in relation to the slaughterhouse, that's a live example. You have to be there as a candidate talking about why you stand with these workers, why it is important that they shut down this slaughterhouse and that they take the corporations and the billionaires take responsibility for these dangerous workplace conditions. That's the approach we've used in every campaign. It's not just, first of all, our campaign is a live thing and we are raising our demands all the time, but it's not just that. It has to be part of the overall struggles that break out. And so if there's a struggle that breaks out, you need to be out there on the forefront. Just one other thing I'll mention, because it would be remiss of me if I didn't, which is that Socialist Alternative, however, has not used an approach where a candidate decides they're going to run for office and then builds the infrastructure, political infrastructure around it. I don't think ultimately that is going to do it. We cannot have just people waking up one day and individuals wanting to run for office. I mean, that's a good sentiment, but ultimately, as I said before, it's not about numbers. It's about what are you actually going to do with your campaign? And if you win, what are you going to do with that victory? I mean, as I said, it cannot be underestimated, the pressure that elected officials will come under. And this will be true even for elected leaders in the labor movement. It will be true for unelected leaders, informal leaders who rise up in social movements. Ultimately, you will come under pressure because that's what the establishment and the ruling class will do. So the approach we've used in Socialist Alternative is not that it's not like I woke up one day and decided to run for office and then my organization, backed me up or something like that. We democratically decided that it was time probably to test out an election campaign. We democratically decided and voted on what the campaign's platform should be. Should we call for $15 an hour? That was a subject of serious political discussion because, what demands you raise it has to be seriously decided. Based on an understanding of what it is that workers will actually come out and fight for. And also who the candidate should be was also a subject of democratic discussion. And ideally, what we need is a working class party that will have that approach where candidates are part of a movement building strategy as a whole.
Thank you. I think for the last question today, I'm going to try to amalgamate a couple of thoughts that were floating around in the chat. So Kshama, you mentioned that the movement needs to be international because capitalism is international as well. So some of the discussion in the chat that was going on was about how it's one thing to impose a tax, it's another thing to collect it. And when you saw things like Uber threatening to leave California when things weren't going according to their way, offshore accounts in the Bahamas, all these ways that corporations and the mega wealthy can hide their wealth and keep it from being put into the collective public and to fund our services and things like that. So I'm just wondering, what do you think are the steps that are necessary so that the ruling class pays their fair share?
In terms of, taxing big business, and I think the Uber example that you mentioned, I think all of this, our example in Seattle, the example that is ongoing in Bessemer, Alabama, where Amazon workers are unionizing, and I think all of this is tied to your question about making big business pay. I wouldn't necessarily use the phrase fair share. Obviously they're paying and nothing close to their fair share, but at the end of the day, taxing big business, we will have to go beyond that. But we also have to start, our starting point, of course, is even winning taxes on big business is going to be a hard task. Winning any such reform is going to be a hard task. So your question is really on point. But what I was saying was that our example of winning the Amazon tax and what we are seeing ongoing in Alabama, all of this, what it shows, and also the Uber example in California, all of this shows that big business will be ruthless in their opposition to even small things like, in my view, increasing their taxes is a small thing that we can achieve, because the world is in such a bad place that we need to go far beyond that. And so the least that we can demand from them is for them to pay higher taxes. And in the case of Washington State, some of those corporations are not even paying any taxes. In fact, we have the most regressive tax system in the entire nation. Washington state. And in fact, if you count up all the subsidies that big corporations like Boeing, Microsoft, and Amazon get from the state, paid for by public, by working class people paying taxes, they actually pay a negative tax rate, which means that the subsidies outweigh the taxes that they pay into the state coffers. So in that situation, obviously, raising the Amazon tax was a very, very crucial demand. And what we saw was Amazon and Jeff Bezos just going to the mat to oppose it. When we were first fighting for it in 2018, Amazon and Jeff Bezos actually threatened to take away construction jobs, 7,000 construction jobs. And one of the issues that came up there at that time, it ties to why Uber was able to defeat the ballot initiative in California last November also, is that because of this threat against construction jobs, what happened was rather some of the labor leaders, some of the most conservative labor leaders, rather than recognizing that, no, this is not an empty threat. Obviously, we don't take lightly when the richest man in the world says something, we don't take it lightly because he has the power to carry it out. So we're dead serious about our politics. But at the same time, what we said was that the only way they will do it is if we let them do it. They are expecting to divide and conquer this movement by saying that it's not in the interest of the construction workers to fight for the Amazon tax, stand with us. And we reject those divisions because those construction workers, in fact, are not able to afford to live in Seattle because there's no affordable housing. I mean, with a union job, with one of the best wages in the city for these construction workers, they live in the surrounding cities and they have long drives, drive through traffic, and they struggle for their own livelihoods. So rather than making these points of unity, which we were making, labor leaders at that time did a very bad thing. I mean, and I speak as a rank and file member of the labor movement myself, and we have to have a critique within the left and inside labor as well on bad ideas and bad tactics. What they did instead, rather than building unity between the construction workers and other workers, they instead openly opposed the Amazon tax. And in fact, one day they ambushed the Tax Amazon press conference and they chanted against us. And in fact, Logan Swan, who is a member of Socialist Alternative in Seattle, and who is also a union iron worker, his own brothers, union brothers, were chanting against the Amazon tax. And he stood there so courageously at the press conference and said, "My brothers, you are wrong. This is not going to work. At the end of the day, these bosses, they're going to destroy all of our livelihoods, and we are not going to have affordable housing or jobs. And these union jobs are not there thanks to Jeff Bezos. These union jobs are there because the labor movement fought for it in the past. We fought for those jobs. And so we absolutely should be fighting both for our union jobs and for affordable housing, or else we will have neither." And now 3 years later, Logan tells us that some of the workers have been won over. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate it, but at the same time, it's true. They're seeing that, look, we fought against the Amazon tax at that time, but what did the bosses do for us? They sold us out. Our lives are not getting any better. Our relatives are dying out of COVID. Our salaries have stagnated, even though we have a union. So what's happening here, and how did the billionaires get so much richer? I think that the strategy of building principled unity on the ground among working people is fundamental to winning. And I'll just end on this. The Uber won a victory in California against a very, very popular ballot initiative because the labor leaders there allowed them to do divide and conquer on a similar basis, where rather than uniting unionized and non-unionized workers, unfortunately, the labor leaders put their faith in this, let's work with the bosses, let's work with the Uber bosses, let's find common ground. No, you want to find common ground, go to the workers and unite them. That's where the common ground lies. You don't make unity with the bosses because the bosses are not in unity with you.
So, Kshama, I know I speak for everyone who's on this call in saying thank you so much for being here with us. This has been such an inspiring day to share these ideas, to think about how we're going to implement them here in Alberta. And we just cannot thank you enough for being with us today. How can people stay involved with you, with your campaign, with whatever's going on? How can people stay in the loop with what you're doing?
So first of all, I would really highly, encourage everybody and just sort of echoing what Leslie was saying earlier. Please contact Socialist Alternative Canada if, because I'm assuming everyone except me is from Alberta or somewhere in Canada. I would really urge you to contact Socialist Alternative there and see if this is an organization you would like to join. If you like what we've heard, then we really want you to work with us or join us. Either way, we want to make sure that we build the kind of broad-based unity that I was talking about, that others were talking about. And then I would also urge you to check out socialistalternative.org in the US, but also KshamaSolidarity.org, which is the URL of the solidarity campaign that we are building against the recall effort. Now, unfortunately, as Canadians, you are not going to be able to donate to the campaign, but we still need your support. So concretely, what I would urge you all is that if there are community and labor leaders who support what we are doing, who are against the recall, who understand that internationally we need solidarity against this recall, because if they succeed in recalling us as a prominent socialist office, they will use it as a template, not just in the US, but internationally also. So we all have a stake in preventing this recall from winning. And so on that basis, if we can have public endorsements of our solidarity campaign from labor leaders, community leaders, from your organizations that have organized today's event, I think that will be really crucial because we are trying to build international solidarity against the recall as well.
Great. Well, thanks again, Kshama. Unfortunately, we were unable to get to everyone's questions in the chat, but we just appreciate you all participating and showing up. We'll be doing a bit of an email follow-up, providing some clear calls to action, ways to connect with Socialist Alternative Canada, and some other groups such as Progress Alberta, Stand Up to Kenny, which is a great local organization resisting Jason Kenney, and some ways to maybe contact your local representative to share about the things that matter most to you. Thank you so much. I don't know if anyone else wanted to share their thanks or gratitude, but please feel free to type in the chat. There's some lovely comments coming in. And we just really, really appreciate you joining us tonight, Kshama. I know that you have so much going on, so it means so much to us that you've taken this time to share your story and your passion and your love with us.
Thank you so much for including me in this discussion. Really appreciate it. And solidarity to you all.
Maybe we could, we have a couple of things that we can highlight here as immediate actions that folks who are on the call can take. So Free Transit Edmonton is running a campaign right now in response to a proposed fare increase that's happening for cash fares in the city, which will render the Edmonton transit service as one of the highest in Canada. And I think we can all agree that the Edmonton Transit Service is not one of the best transit systems in Canada, so we should probably be looking at improving it before becoming one of the highest ones. So Free Transit Edmonton, for those that don't know, is a grassroots campaign that's dedicated to fare-free and expanded transportation. And this is just an immediate thing that they want to make halted, because when we think about what the direction of the city is going in terms of giving tax breaks and grants to developers and to housing developers and owners of condo blocks, while increasing the cash fare, it's just unacceptable. So you can head to freetransitedmonton.ca to sign on to that petition. The other thing that I would like to highlight here is that in this landscape that we're in Alberta, with so many cuts and threats to our public services happening all the time. One thing that I'd really like to highlight with you all, we have an active campaign running on it, is the Stop Post-Secondary Cuts campaign. We have that going at stoppsccuts.ca. The last round of budget cuts dealt out an additional massive cut, bringing the total over the last 3 budget cycles to almost $700 million, which has meant a decrease in quality of education. It has meant even more precarious work for instructors at our colleges and universities, and it has meant higher tuition costs with a lower quality of education for Alberta students. So I would really encourage you to head over to stoppseccuts.ca, and you can take action, sign a letter to go to your elected representative, and you can ask for a campaign sign there as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. And
Sorry.
once again, we'll be sure to share some of that stuff with you in a follow-up email in the next week or so. So thanks again to everyone. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Public Interest Alberta, and everyone. This has just been great.
Thank you. That was, yeah, great discussion. Thank you all.
Bye all. Thank you.